Welcome to the CSS3 project training series. This is a project tutorial that's going to look at some of the new features that are available in CSS3. And in this tutorial, we're actually going to be working with the new Flexbox properties of CSS3. So the Flexbox layout that's currently in the final stages of approval is designed to provide a more efficient way to lay out, align, and distribute space among page items that are located in containers on your HTML page. The main concept behind the Flex layout is to give the container the ability to alter its items width and height to best fill the available space. A Flex container expands items to fill available space and shrinks them to prevent overflow. As per the W3C, the Flexbox layout is most appropriate to the layout of the components of an application and small-scale layouts, whereas the new grid layout properties are intended for larger scale layouts. And we'll actually do some tutorials on the grid scale layout properties in a future tutorial. Since Flexbox is an entire module and not just a single property, it involves a lot of different elements, including a complete set of properties. Some of those properties are meant to be set on the container, which is the parent element known as the Flex container, whereas the other properties are meant to be set on the children, known as the Flex items. If a regular layout is based on both block and inline flow directions, the Flex layout is based on Flex flow directions. Please have a look at this figure from the specification explaining the main idea behind the Flex layout. And we're just going to walk through real quickly. This is taken right from the W3C sites. A Flex container is the box generated by an element with a computed display of Flex or inline Flex. Inflow children of a Flex container are called Flex items and are laid out using the Flex layout model. And we're going to go through a couple different demonstrations of this in our lab exercise. Unlike block and inline layout, whose layout calculations are biased to the block and inline flow directions, Flex layout is biased to the Flex directions. The Flex flow value determines how these terms map to physical directions, top, right, bottom, and left, axes, vertical and horizontal, and sizes, width and height. The main axis or main dimension, the main axis of a Flex container is the primary axis along which Flex items are laid out. It extends in the main direction, and if you look, you can actually see this. The main axis is going from left to right, and it extends in the container in the main dimension. The main start and main end, the Flex items are placed within the container starting on the main start side, which is right here, and going towards the main end side, which is here. Main size and main size property, a Flex item's width or height, whichever is in the main dimension, is the item's main size. The Flex item's main size property is either the width or height property, whichever is in the main dimension. The cross-axis, cross-dimension, the axis perpendicular to the main axis is called the cross-axis. It extends in the cross-dimension. And again, you'll see a lot of these demonstrations as we go through the lab, so don't get concerned if you don't understand exactly what we're talking about yet. This is the specification from the WC3. The cross-start and cross-end Flex lines are filled with items and placed into the container starting on the cross-start side of the Flex container and going toward the cross-end side. The cross size and cross size property, the width or height of a Flex item, whichever is in the cross dimension, is the item's cross size. The cross size property is whichever of width or height that is in the cross dimension. So the properties that we're going to be concerned with for the parent container, which is the Flex container, are display, Flex direction, Flex wrap, Flex flow, justify content, align items, and align content. These are all the properties that pertain to the Flex container, the parent container for our Flex flow. And then we have Flex items. And Flex items also have properties. We have the order, the Flex grow, the Flex shrink, Flex basis, Flex, and then the align self. And again, we're going to be practicing a lot of these as we go through the lab demonstrations. I just wanted to give you a list of the available properties for both the parent, which is the Flex container, and the children, which are the Flex items. So let's move into our development environment and demonstrate what we've been discussing in the presentation and work through some of these examples. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and minimize my presentation. Let's get into our development environment. First thing I'm going to do is confirm that my Apache server is up and running. I'm going to go ahead and bring up Google Chrome, which will be my browser for this particular exercise, and Sublime Text 2, which will be my text editor. And we're going to start with a pretty simple example of the Flex model. This is a problem that we run into all the time as we're working through our designing our web pages, and it's on centering items on our web page. So with the Flex model, there's a couple of very easy ways to do this. So let's look at centering items on our web page. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm starting out with my base file, flex.html. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. I want to save this as flex_1.html so that we can make some changes to this. If you have access to the exercise files, you'll have copies of all these different iterations. I'm going to go ahead in my body section. I'm going to add an H1 heading, and I'm just going to put a title in here, and we're going to call this centering an item using the Flex model. I'm going to go ahead and close out that H1 tag, and I'm going to come down right below the H1, and now I want to do a couple of divs. And keep in mind, as we talked about during the presentation, in order to correctly use the Flex model, we've got to have a parent div or a container. So I'm going to come down right below that H1, and I'm going to put in an opening div, and I'm going to give this an ID or a class. Let's give it a class equal parent. So this will be our parent div. Obviously, I enclose that in quotation marks. I'm going to close out the opening, come down a couple lines and close out that parent div. And then right inside there, I'm actually going to add another div. So I'm going to give my opening div tag, I'm going to give this a class child. Close out the opening tag, and then close out that child div. So now I've got this parent and I've got this child div. So now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add some styling inside of I'm going to just put these, embed the styles right inside our head section. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. If we refresh our browser window, let's go back and reload this Flex 1. Refresh our browser window. All we actually see is the H1 heading that we gave because we don't have anything in our div elements yet. So let's go ahead and add some styles. I'm going to go up in the head section of my document. I'm going to give an opening style tag. I'm going to come down a few lines and put in my closing style tag. This way I can put my styling right inside the actual document that we're working in. And the first thing I'm going to do is let's go ahead and address that parent. So I'm going to address my parent class. So I'm going to put my period, parent, which is the name of the class we're going to address, opening curly brace, and then my closing curly brace. And let's go put a couple of settings in here. The first thing I'm going to do is put in a display of Flex, because we are using the new Flex model. And you'll notice that my text editor doesn't highlight Flex as a valid keyword for CSS yet, because even though Sublime Text 2 is relatively up to date, this is so new that a lot of the stuff, even though it's available in my browser, is not yet been identified as keywords inside my text editor. Some of the other ones that I use actually do recognize this already. Sublime Text 2 does not. I'm going to go ahead and put a height in there of 100 pixels. And I'm going to put a background. So I'm going to use a background for this particular one of pound FF6. And by the way, the beta Sublime Text 3 does actually recognize those keywords. I'm going to have to save those changes, refresh my browser window, and you can see now that we actually have that display Flex element that's now got that nice light background of yellow displayed across my page. So now let's go ahead and address the actual child itself, which is the element that we're trying to center. So I'm going to put my period in there with my child class to identify the child class. I'm going to give it a width of 50 pixels. I'm going to come down and give it a height of 50 pixels. Come down right below that. I'm going to give it a background of pound 9C9. You can make these, by the way, anything that you wanted to make these. And I'm going to say my margin is auto. And this is kind of cool because remember we used to use the margin left, margin right, and all that stuff. Well, now I'm just going to say margin auto. I'm going to refresh my browser window, and now I've got that nice light green square that's centered inside that element. And by the way, if I reshape this, it stays centered. So now that one little square that we've got, that we've actually put into our page now, become centered based on the margin auto settings that we use and the fact that we set up the parent as a flex item. So I mean, it's one of the things that we do a lot that we tend to struggle with HTML and CSS is centering items. There's one really quick way to center items using that new flex property inside of CSS3. All right, so let's take it a step further. We just barely scratched the surface on this flex model. I'm going to actually go one step further. I'm going to do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as flex_2.html. Again, this way if you have access to the exercise file, you'll have all the different things that we're doing here. I'm going to go ahead and remove all this code. I'm going to keep my style tags in there though, because we're going to be using those. And let's go ahead and remove all of my divs, the divs that I put in this one. Let's go ahead and look at something a little more complex. I'm going to just call this one creating a flex model. And right below there, what I want to do now is let's pretend I'm going to take 9 items to our HTML layout, and I'm going to set them up like a photo page that will have fixed dimensions. We want them to be nicely distributed across the HTML page, and we want them to act responsively. So I want to take all these different items now and set them up in my HTML document where they're going to act responsibly. Did I save all those changes? I thought I did. There we go. Creating a flex model. We want them to act responsibly, or responsively, not responsibly. We want them to act responsively. So in the event our page changes, we have this nice little aligning model that's going to change with it. So again, we're going to set up a class. I'm going to come right down here below my H1 tag. I'm going to set up a div. And this div is going to have a class of parent, just like we had done in the previous exercise. I'm going to close out the opening tag, come down a few lines and close out the closing tag. And then inside the parent, remember what I said is we want to actually set a bunch of photos in here like this was a photo page. So I'm just going to go ahead and use an image class. So I'm going to come right down below that and I'm going to use my image tag. I'm going to give it a class of child, and again, keep in mind, you could name these anything you want to. I'm just trying to keep these named in this particular way so that it's easy for you to follow what I'm doing, because we've been talking about parent-children since we started this discussion. And then I'm just going to go ahead and copy this image tag, and I'm going to paste 8 of them underneath this. Go ahead and take out that blank line. I'm going to scroll up a little bit, and that'd be a great time to pause if you wanted to go ahead and type this in. And again, we should have our parent and 9 children inside there. And this is what we're going to be working with for this particular demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and change those changes. And again, if I were to update my browser window, I'm not going to see any changes yet because we actually haven't added any CSS where these things are visible. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come under my style tags, and let's address that parent class that we actually set our first div, my opening and closing curly braces. And the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and give some padding. I'm going to give it a padding to 0, and I'm going to give it a margin to 0. Come down right below that, and now because of the different things that are available with our different rendering engines, I'm actually going to start addressing now the WebKit, the Mozilla, the Microsoft, and just so that we make certain that we're hitting all the different browsers in this particular way. I'm going to say display, put in my semicolon. This is going to be for my WebKit, so it's dash WebKit, dash box. Then I'm going to come down right below that. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this so you don't have to watch me type all this. I'm going to come right down below the WebKit box. I'm going to paste that in. This one is going to address my Mozilla. So it's going to be dash MOZ. Come down right below that one, paste this one in. This one is going to be for my Microsoft. But in Microsoft, it's actually not called Box, it's called Flexbox for Internet Explorer. Then I'm going to come down right below that. We're going to do the WebKit-Flex. So you can see that the WebKit rendering engine actually worked at this in 2 different ways right now, because not everybody's up to the same level yet. And then I'm just going to put display :flex for all the engines or all the browsers that are currently to this point. Then I'm going to come down and do one more. It's going to be WebKit -flex-flow. Put in my semicolon, and this is going to be row wrap. And we actually talked about this in the presentation. This is some of the properties that we can use inside of our container. So we're looking at the row and we're looking at the wrap. And we'll talk more about those as we move on. Then I'm going to have justify content. And again, this is another one of the properties that we talked about inside our presentation. So I have justify, content, and I want to just put space around. So it's going to keep the space around the items equal. So I'm going to save that change. If I were to refresh the browser window, you'll notice we don't see any changes yet. And the reason being is because we haven't done anything with our children. So I'm going to come outside the parent class, come into the child class, open and close my curly braces. Now let's start setting up the children of this particular demonstration. And keep in mind that we've given all of our images the class of child. So all of them will be sharing in these settings. And again, because I was simulating a photo page, I'm going to put a background, C60, and that with a semicolon. I'm going to come in here and put a padding, and we're just going to use 5 pixels of padding around all 4 sides of the item. I'm going to give it a width of 100 pixels. I'm going to give it a height of 75 pixels. And again, we're just making these like small thumbnail photos that we're going to display on our page. And we'll put a margin top of 10 pixels. And that should give us the settings we need to get a display. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. And again, remember, we're using this flex display. And this time we're actually using the row wrap and space around properties. Refresh the browser window. Now you can see that we actually have these flex items now on our stage, again, being resized based on how we've set up our flex properties inside CSS. So we created a flex layout context with our display flex. This is what creates the actual flex layout. Then we define the flow direction and how we want the items to wrap. Remember, this is the same as flex direction. This is what we did right here, the flow direction and how we want them to wrap. So the direction is row, and we do want them to wrap. So instead of shrinking in size, they're going to wrap around. Then as we define how to distribute it, the remaining space, and we said space around. So based on how we're setting this up, the space around should be maintained equally as we can do that based on how we set up the flex flow. So the flex model is very cool. I mean, there's a lot of cool things that we can do with this model. So in part 1 of the tutorial, we actually reviewed the properties that were available with the flex model. We went through a couple demonstrations of using the flex model with some pretty simplistic demonstrations on how we can actually use it. And in part 2, we'll actually lay out a web page using the flex model. And again, we'll review the properties that are available in the new flex model property of CSS3. So I look forward to seeing you there.